Our topic this evening, kind of a fun one, I think. What is the Ark of the Covenant? I gave you guys, last week I gave you homework. I had everybody go back and rewatch Raiders of the Lost Ark. I did that over the weekend. It is a fun movie. I really enjoyed seeing it. I hadn't seen it in maybe 20 years. So this is an image of the Ark of the Covenant at a secret submarine base that the Nazis have in the Aegean. Nazis have a hold of it as they're going to try to open it up, much to their detriment. So in this movie, while meeting with U.S. government officials, Professor Henry Indiana Jones Jr. describes the Ark of the Covenant to them. These guys who he questions whether they've even been to Sunday school, that they don't know this stuff. He says, the Ark of the Covenant is the chest that the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments in. Indiana Jones says, the Hebrews took the broken pieces of the original stone tablets of the Ten Commandments that Moses had smashed at Mount Horeb, and they put them in the Ark, and then when they settled in Canaan, they put the Ark in a place called the Temple of Solomon, which his friend says is in Jerusalem, where then it stayed for many years until all of a sudden, whoosh, it's gone. He has a big book, which I think he's just carrying around a Bible. Anyway, so he has a big old Bible that he opens up and he finds a picture that illustrates what the Ark is supposed to be. And they ask, what are all those rays coming out of it? It's supposed to be lightning, power of God, that sort of thing. So Indiana Jones's friend, Dr. Marcus Brody, says, the Bible speaks of the Ark leveling mountains, which actually I don't think is true, laying waste to entire regions, which that does get true for the Philistines, as we'll see. He says, an army which carries the Ark before it is invincible. And we'll see that also there's a qualification of that's fairly important. A little asterisk there that the Nazis should also be worried about potentially. So later in the movie, there is another archaeologist, the villain, Dr. René Belloc, and he gives his theory about the Ark. He says, Jones, don't you realize what the Ark is? It's a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God, and it's within my reach. So this is kind of the interesting, fun ways in which this artifact is talked about in this movie. Ultimately, the Ark in the movie ends up displaying significant supernatural powers, blows up all the German cameras and melts the faces of everyone who looks at it. And Indiana Jones and his girlfriend survive by closing their eyes. So let's look at the Ark in the Hebrew Bible. How close is what we got from the movie? So from the time the Ark of the Covenant is introduced in the book of Exodus, the Ark has a prominent role in the Torah, that is, the rest of the Torah, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then it also has a pretty prominent role in the Deuteronomistic histories, which is to say, the book of Joshua especially. It's mentioned in Judges, it's in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings. And so in other words, those are we call them the histories, but they're not mostly historical until you get to the end. But nevertheless, these are the books that follow the Torah in the Christian Old Testament, along then with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is just a later derivative book that is recasting the Deuteronomistic histories and rewriting it. Other than that, surprisingly, considering kind of how important it is in the Torah, the Ark of the Covenant is actually only mentioned in the Psalms, just in 2 Psalms even, not even more than that, which is surprising. And it's mentioned once in the book of Jeremiah, but none of the other prophets, Isaiah or anybody, are talking about it. And so, this is one of these things I think that we keep on discovering. We had a whole lecture, which was essentially, when did the Torah become important? And what's so surprising is that we have all of these biblical traditions, the prophetic tradition, the wisdom tradition, the psalm tradition, and so on, many of which that are not making a lot of use or extensive quotation, especially in the early parts of the tradition, of the Torah. And this seems to be the case here again with what is otherwise seemingly a very important artifact in the Torah story. So the books, the artifact completely has gone and fallen out of history by the time the Bible is being put together, that is to say in the Second Temple period. So once we get to the Persian period and the exiles, when the Judean exiles in Babylon are given permission by the Persians to return to Jerusalem to kind of rebuild the city, although it makes it a very tiny city indeed, what they end up with. It's a fairly poor sub-capital of a minor Persian province. And then they also rebuild a new temple to replace the first temple, Solomon's temple. There is, in that rebuilding of the temple, no mention of the ark. So among the different sacred vessels that exist in the second temple, like for example the menorah that the Romans end up plundering and taking back with them, and it's on a frieze relief of it is on the Arch of Titus in Rome when the Romans destroy Herod's temple, the end of the second temple. There was no ark to loot because there was never an Ark of the Covenant in the second temple from the time of Ezra on. The ark was already lost long before the construction of the second temple, and therefore, like I say, it's not part of Second Temple Judaism other than its memory. So the prophet Jeremiah, who does mention the ark in his book, he is active in the very last generations of the kingdom of Judah. So the first temple period prior to its fall. So when the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, Jeremiah is alive and he actually goes into exile in Egypt. And so he's active a little bit past that into the exile period. And Jeremiah is also associated with that Deuteronomistic school. So that whatever the literary group that is producing or editing together older archives and writing the books that become Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, those seem to be related anyway, or at least share themes with Jeremiah's work, as well as with the book of Deuteronomy. And even traditionally, according to ancient tradition, which is often not very good at identifying things, Jeremiah is the traditional author or compiler or editor of those books. So that connection has been noted for a long time. Okay, so nevertheless, even though the Ark of the Covenant is important in the book of Deuteronomy, and it continues to play a big role in the books like Joshua and Kings and Samuel, nevertheless, the one mention that Jeremiah has about the Ark is a prophecy, which is essentially negative about the Ark. So even though he's having a prophecy, so Jerusalem is going to fall or has fallen, and he is now looking for a time when all of Israel, both the north and the south, will be restored, it isn't going to include an Ark of the Covenant. And so what he says in chapter 3 of his book, "Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, and bring you to Zion. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. In those days, when your numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, people will no longer say, 'The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord.' It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made." So in other words, scattered Israel is going to be restored. They're going to go back to Mount Zion to say Jerusalem. They're going to have their numbers increased, but they won't even remember the Ark of the Covenant. They're not going to have it. It's not going to be around. They're not going to make a new one, and they're not going to miss the old one. So at that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. In those days, the people of Judah will join the people of Israel, and together they will come from a northern land to the land I gave your ancestors as an inheritance. So we're having this huge restoration of Israel prophesied, but it's not going to include an Ark of the Covenant. So this sort of gives the implication that already by Jeremiah's day, the Ark is lost, and maybe it was taken away to Babylon and when Jerusalem is conquered, or possibly it had been lost in some earlier military encounter, which is nevertheless, though, whatever happened to it isn't explicitly mentioned in any biblical narrative. But Jeremiah, anyway, seems to feel like it's gone. He's not worried about it anymore. We're all going to forget about it, and we're not going to have an ark anymore in the future. So, other than Jeremiah's prophecy and the implication that the ark was already lost, the ark is not actually explicitly mentioned in any of the later and more historic sections of the Deuteronomistic histories. So we've talked about how Exodus, the Torah, of course, but then Joshua and Judges are in a still taking place in a legendary, heroic, mythic past, and that's true all the way down through David and Solomon, and it's really only when you're getting into the divided kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, the north, the kingdom of Judah, that we start to get into historic territory. And at that point, the ark is no longer in the narrative explicitly. So for example, when Hilkiah the high priest finds the book of the law in the temple during the reign of King Josiah, the text in Kings, in the book of Kings, fails to explicitly mention that they are finding it. They're finding it in the inner sanctuary, but they're not saying whether the ark is actually there or not. So in the book of Deuteronomy itself, the Levites are told to put the book of Deuteronomy, put the book of the law next to the ark. And so then they let it go. And later, then again, in Hilkiah finds it in that location, but it just says in the sanctuary, it doesn't say that the ark is still there. So it's not even clear, even at this point, I think, that within Hilkiah or Josiah's time, that the ark is necessarily still there, although it may be. It sort of seems like there is, but it may not be. So once Solomon places the ark inside the newly built first temple, the ark really falls out of the Deuteronomistic narrative. So this is an image of what the first temple would have been like as described in the Bible. And again, this is probably not what it would have been like in the kind of mythic age of Solomon, where there might have been an earlier, smaller shrine, and then later, by the time you get to Josiah's period, they will have built the temple up into something like this, as it's then described in the Bible, as if it were much, much older. But essentially, this would be a fairly common plan to any Canaanite pagan temple, where again, these are not like churches where everybody goes into a church or a mosque or a synagogue where you have the congregation all meeting together. Instead, pagan temples, or this kind of temple, are houses for the god. And so the people are outside where the sacrifices are happening, and it's only the priests who go into the sanctuary where God's presence is felt. And in normal ones of these, which would say the pagan ones, you would have a big cult statue, an idol of the god. So there's a huge statue of Athena in the Parthenon in Athens. And there would have been a big statue of Dagon in the Temple of Dagon in Philistia, and so on. But here, instead of that, we have the Ark of the Covenant, where the statue would be, because already by the time of Josiah, their understanding then, the reformers' understanding of the worship of Yahweh, the worship of the God of Israel, is that God is not to be pictured or made in statue form. Like I said, there's 2 mentions of the ark in the Psalms. So Psalm 132 is written as though it's from David's time, and it's talking about David's desire after he's king, or before he's king, or was at the beginning of his reign, to find a dwelling place for God to place the ark. So originally, the ark is wandering. It's present, as we said, in the Exodus story, where it is part inside a tabernacle or a tent complex that is like a mobile temple. And like I say, this Psalm 132 is ostensibly set before the eponymous founder of the royal house of Jerusalem, David, established Jerusalem as Judah's capital. But it's actually likely written by the exiles in Babylon, who are themselves looking forward to seeking restoration of a Jerusalem temple. So let's read it. It says, "O Lord, remember in David's favor all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord, I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Rise up, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might." So the ark, is this mobile center place where the Lord's presence is felt, and the idea of it is it has these wings on top of it that form a place for God's presence to rest upon. And so that's why it's saying here it's his footstool. So the ark is a footstool for God to be. It's called the ark of your might here in the Psalms twice, not the ark of the covenant. And the idea of it is that they're looking for a place to put it. So why do I say this is a later one? Because the psalm goes on to say, the Lord swore to David a sure oath, one from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. There I will cause a horn to sprout up for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed one. Anointed one is Messiah here. So these are looking for some Davidic kingdom to be restored. So these are people not who are alive at David's time, who already have David. These are people who are living at the time of the exile or after the exile, who are hoping for a messianic restoration, where somebody from the house of David, a horn, will sprout up from David's legacy in order to have a new son of his body to set on the throne. So that kind of a theme dates from the Babylonian exile or afterwards. So what this does show is that some of the exiles are still envisioning, an ark in the temple, even though there doesn't end up being one in the Second Temple period. The other place where we have a reference to an ark of might is Psalm 78. So that psalm has a superscription now that later editors added to it that identifies it as a maskil of Asaph. And maskil is a word that occurs in the Psalms, and it has some musical meaning that has, it has to be theorized. And Asaph is a legendary singer living in the kind of mythic time period of David and Solomon. So the psalm talks about the tribes of Israel rebelling against the Lord prior to the construction of the first Jerusalem temple, Solomon's temple. So the Israelites, put God to the test. They rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. Like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. They angered him with their high places. They aroused his jealousy with their idols. When God heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among humans. He sent the art of his might into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy. So this kind of a psalm is giving that same theme of the reformers, the Deuteronomistic reformers. So their goal is to purge Israel from any worship of any god besides the God of Israel. So they want to take all of the former temples that the Levites had that are called the high places. So all of those are being suppressed because the high places are places that are associated by the reformers with this paganism. They also want to destroy all the idols. And because though the psalmist here is saying everybody isn't getting with the reforms, God is mad. And so therefore he abandons the tabernacle, that tent where the ark is kept, which is called here the tabernacle of Shiloh. So the psalm is identifying the tabernacle with Shiloh, and we'll see there's other identifications of the tabernacle with Shiloh. And the ark of his might goes into captivity. And so this is referencing a story of the ark being captured by the Philistines in the Deuteronomistic histories, as we'll see. Other than that, though, there's no other references to the ark in the Psalms that I could see, and so I was a little bit surprised by that. So let's look at this association with Shiloh. So when we're getting into the historic period, that's when we already have the stronger, bigger kingdom in the north, the kingdom of Israel, and its poorer, lesser populated, smaller cousin, the kingdom of Judah. And so Israel is centered on the cities of Samaria and Shechem, but there are other shrines. So for example, there are shrines that the kings of Israel set up at the two borders of Israel, one at Dan in the far north, you can see, and one at Bethel, the house of God in the tribe of Benjamin, pretty close to the south border with Jerusalem. And so the idea of those, just like the Ark of the Covenant in the Jerusalem temple has a little mercy seat for God's presence to sit on when God is in the temple, it seems to be that the idea of the Israelite kings are, there's one little footstool shrine at Bethel and one at Dan, and so God's presence standing on essentially two little golden calves statues is able to cover over the entire nation of Israel and protect it. So there are those two shrines, and then you can also see, I don't know if you can zoom in enough on your picture of it, but in this map of the northern kingdom between Bethel and Shechem, where Mount Gerizim is Shiloh. So this is a major shrine in the northern kingdom. So according to Jeremiah, who may be associated with the line of priests from Shiloh, Shiloh was the site of Israel's original national shrine. And we also hear that the ark was housed in Shiloh during the beginning of the book of Samuel. So there are associations both in the book of Jeremiah and also in the Deuteronomic histories with Shiloh, as well as that psalm. So we read in Jeremiah, the Lord tells him, "Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name." So in other words, the first place where God made a dwelling for his name, according to Jeremiah, is Shiloh. "And see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel." So by Jeremiah's day, the northern kingdom has been destroyed by the Assyrians. And so Shiloh, this first place where Yahweh made his home, the first shrine to Yahwism, is destroyed. "While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the house in Jerusalem, the temple you trust in, the place I gave to you and your ancestors. I will thrust you from my presence, O Judahites, just as I did to all of your fellow Israelites, the people of Ephraim, the more powerful tribe, the northern kingdom. So just as Israel fell, just as the original national shrine for Yahwism was destroyed, so too will Judah fall, and Jerusalem be destroyed if all of these pagan practices persist. And this is also the very passage where then Jeremiah goes on and talks about how all of the women in Jerusalem are baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and everybody is continuing to, all of their regular pagan practices that they've always had, all the way up here at the very end of the First Temple period. All right, so that's where, again, we're looking at all of the different books in the Hebrew Bible that have references to the Ark of the Covenant. And like I say, that's a lot less mentioning of the Ark than I probably expected when I picked this topic. So considering how important the Ark is in that legendary or mythic period from Moses all the way up through Solomon, the Ark gets surprisingly little mention in the later biblical texts. So I'm going to go back to Indiana Jones. We have this thing that is incredibly important from the Exodus up until Solomon's temple, until, quote, all of a sudden, whoosh, it's gone. And, the FBI guys say, well, what happened to it? Well, let's look at it in those biblical sources. So starting with the Torah, in this case, it's not in Genesis. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. As we've seen in plenty of previous lectures, the Torah includes multiple voices. This is a diagram of how they might have come together via the documentary hypothesis, but whether or not this is how it came together or whether this was added to by supplementary means. Nevertheless, all scholars agree that there's multiple voices, I think, and that the Yahweh source, the J source, and the priestly source are very easily identifiable. They have very different themes and different ways of speaking and language and so forth. The documentary hypothesis supposes that there is another source distinct from J called the Elohist source, but that's not particularly important here, as we'll see, because the Elohist source makes no mention at all of the Ark of the Covenant. And then the book of Deuteronomy is long understood to be like a distinct voice. And so then only the question is, how does it relate to the other ones? So we'll talk about, the Elohist, but also the Yahwist, priestly, and Deuteronomic sources here. Like I say, the Elohist source is the most difficult to tease out, and a bunch of scholars say there is no Elohist source, and they therefore then reject the documentary hypothesis. The idea of the Elohist source, and it's so-called the Elohist source because Moses is the great hero of this text, and God first tells his name, Yahweh, to Moses at the burning bush. Moses says, if I go to Pharaoh, there are all the people, and ask the people to follow me, and let the people go and follow me. They're going to ask, well, what is God's name? And so that is the moment that God reveals God's name, Yahweh, to Moses. And if the Elohist source was a distinct voice, the idea of it is it always uses the word Elohim or some variation of that, and never uses the name Yahweh until the name Yahweh is revealed. And this contrasts with, for example, the Yahweh source, which always calls God Yahweh, or indiscriminately calls God Yahweh or Elohim right from the beginning. So like I say, though, regardless, the Elohist source makes no mention of the Ark. And I think this is interesting because it's despite the fact that otherwise we see that the Ark is associated with Shiloh, which is a northern site. So the Elohist source normally is interested in lionizing northern heroes like Jacob, who, for example, wrestled with an angel at Bethel, a northern shrine site, the house of God, and also Joseph, whose sons Ephraim and Manasseh are the two strongest tribes of the northern kingdom, Ephraim especially. And so it's a little strange that the Elohist source doesn't mention it, but it doesn't. By contrast, the Yahweh source, whose author, like I say, uses the name Yahweh prior to the revelation of that name to Moses, the Yahweh source, the J source, sees the ark as important, but it isn't as worried about its, let's say, priestly function, but is actually sees it as important for military purposes. So the Yahweh source is way less interested in things like priestly rules and things than other sources, and instead is interested in what I call courtly narratives, and especially Judahite heroes. And so, it's theorized that this is someone who is a member of the court in Jerusalem, writing for the entertainment of the other courtiers or the kings. So in the Yahweh sections then, the Israelites bring the ark forward when they confront their enemies. So in the book of Numbers, as the Israelites leave Sinai, the name of the mountain of the Lord in J and P, in the other versions in Deuteronomy in D and E, it's called Horeb, but in J and P it's called Sinai. So the ark is in the vanguard of the company. So the Israelites, set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of the Lord going before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them, the cloud of the Lord being over them by day when they set out from the camp. Whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered and your foes flee before you." And whenever the ark came to rest, Moses would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." So the ark then is seen as housing the Lord's presence, and then that also has the effect, when it's in the vanguard, of scattering Israel's enemies. In Numbers 14, when the Israelites have ceased to follow Moses and the Lord, and they're going off on their own to do things against Moses' counsel, we are told that Moses and the ark do not go with them into battle, which then ends up in a defeat for the Israelites. Moses said, "Why do you continue to transgress the command of the Lord? That will not succeed. Do not go up, for the Lord is not with you. Do not let yourselves be struck down before your enemies, for the Amalekites and the Canaanites will confront you there, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned back from following the Lord. The Lord will not be with you." But they, the Israelites, presumed to go to the heights of the hill country, even though the ark of the covenant of the Lord and Moses had not left the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them, pursuing them as far as Hormah. So, in other words, it has the capacity to scatter them, but when they don't have access to it, they lose the battles. So now if we turn to how the ark is presented in Deuteronomy, in contrast to the Yahweh source, the J source we were just reading, where the ark is kind of a sigil or a totem that's used in warfare, in Deuteronomy, which has more, it's a priestly author, the ark has more sacramental function. And so it's specifically talked about housing the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Deuteronomy, as we know, is often thought to be this book that the priest Hilkiah finds during the reign of Josiah. And the text itself says it will be put in a sanctuary beside the Ark of the Covenant. And so the book of Deuteronomy has a unique voice, and like I say, it's often thought to maybe be either the book found by Hilkiah or maybe just the central Deuteronomic code within Deuteronomy 1 maybe, that is dating from the time of Josiah. So Deuteronomy associates the ark with the 2 stone tablets of the covenant from Moses' time. So it also claims that it's being written by Moses. And so Deuteronomy, we read in chapter 10, "At that time, the Lord said to me," that is to say Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and come up to me on the mountain. Also make me a wooden ark. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke, and then you are to put them in the ark. So in the earlier part of the story, Moses is so upset with the fact that the people in the camp have made a golden calf and have turned to revelry and so forth, that he smashes the original tablets. Now he's making 2 new tablets, and he's also making a wooden ark. So I made an ark out of acacia wood and chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones. And I went up to the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hands. The Lord wrote on the tablets what he had written before, the 10 commandments he had proclaimed to you on the mountain, out of the fire, and on that day of the assembly. And the Lord gave them to me, and I came back down the mountain. I put the tablets in the ark that I made, and as the Lord commanded me, and they are there now. So the ark in Deuteronomy is claimed to have been made by Moses and is where he put the replacement tablets. Deuteronomy further provides a role for the Levites as priests. So at that time, the Lord set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to stand before the Lord to minister and to pronounce blessings in his name, as they still do today. This is why the Levites have no share or inheritance in terms of land among their fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as the Lord your God told them. So Deuteronomy here, therefore, is very inclusive of the Levites, a type of priest, as having an important role that's God-given. Deuteronomy again mentions the ark when Moses reads this law, and so in other words, this Torah, presumably the book of Deuteronomy itself. So Moses wrote down this law, this Torah, this book of Deuteronomy, and he gave it to the Levitical priests. He gave it to the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. So having written down this book that we're reading, Moses, Deuteronomy, this book of the law, and giving it to the Levites who carry the ark, Moses then instructs the Levites to place the book beside the ark. After Moses finished writing in a book of words of this law from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you, for I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you had been rebellious against the Lord while I am alive, that is to say Moses, and still with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? Assemble before me all the elders of your tribes and all your officials, so that I can speak these words in their hearing and call the heavens and the earth to testify against them. And so that's actually just exactly what they do when they find this book of Deuteronomy. When I say find, this book of Deuteronomy in Josiah's time then. And so I think fairly transparently then, the author of Deuteronomy, person who's claiming to be Moses, pseudo-Moses, person who's writing probably at the time of Josiah, tells the Levites within the book to put the book right next to the ark, which is where it's found by Hilkiah the high priest in the book of Kings at the time of King Josiah. And that way this new book, which is pretending to be an old book, can be used to legitimize a program of religious reform. So it has a pious intent. So the interesting thing, though, in Deuteronomy, the Levites put it next to the ark. But like I say, when we get to Kings, they find it in the sanctuary where the ark should be, but they don't specifically say the ark is there. And so that's the one question I have on that. There's some question about whether the ark still exists in the historic times. So Deuteronomy is a priestly book, and it's interested in priestly rules and also religious law. But Deuteronomy focuses on a larger group of priests. So we've seen they're talking about the Levitical priests and the role of the Levites. The priestly source of the Torah, by contrast, sees Levites as very distinct from and very inferior to the important line of priests, the lines of the high priests of Jerusalem, people who see themselves as descended from Aaron via a high priest called Zadok, who is high priest at the time of King David. And so they're essentially a clan whose eponymous ancestor is Zadok, Zadokites or Aaronids. And the Zadokites then claim to have been given a monopoly on the right of sacrifice to Yahweh. So they forbid Levites. Levites had always been doing these sacrifices in the high places, but the Zadokite feel like not only should worship be centralized, but it's only the Zadokite line that are allowed to offer sacrifices. The Levites have a job where they can stand around as attendants and help, but they are distinctly inferior anyway in terms of their claim to the Zadokites. The priestly source is especially interested in sacred vessels used by priests, all kinds of rituals, priestly rules. It's, in my opinion, the boring part of the Torah. This is the reason why Genesis is so interesting in Exodus, but then suddenly we get all of this priestly text and it gets pretty boring. It's about all of how many cubits to make this and that and so on. And that's though, as a result, though, because the ark is a sacred vessel in the first temple, the priestly source has a lot more to say about the ark than any other biblical voice. So, for example, in Exodus 25, a priestly text, we read a description of the ark. So it says, "The Israelites shall make an ark of acacia wood. It shall be 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you shall overlay it, and you shall make a molding of gold upon it and all around. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it and put them on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the one side of it and 2 rings on the other side. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark for carrying the ark. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be removed. You shall put the covenant that I am giving you, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, into the ark. You shall make a cover of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits shall be its width. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold, and you shall make them of hammered work, not graven work, at the 2 ends of the cover. Make 1 cherub at the one end and 1 cherub at the other. Of one piece with the cover you shall make the cherubim at its 2 ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the cover with their wings. They shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be turned towards the cover. You shall put the cover on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the covenant, the tablets of the 10 Commandments that I am giving you. There I will meet with you from above the cover. From between the 2 cherubim that are on the ark, I will tell you all that I am commanding you for the Israelites." So God's presence sits on those cherubim wings, and that essentially becomes the mercy seat. So that description, which I just read, and all the cubits and what the cherubim are doing and so forth, is the basis then for all of these modern reconstructions of what the ark might have looked like, including the version from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So, like we say at the top, there are these 2 cherubs, this cherubim, who are facing each other, and their wings are outstretched, and then God's presence sits on those wings, the mercy seat it's called. So the ark's top is seen, therefore, as a place where the invisible God, Yahweh's presence, would sit within the temple, or as it's literally imagined, it's antecedent to the tabernacle. Likely, as I said, similar to the way the golden calves that existed at the shrines at Bethel and Dan allowed Yahweh's presence to sit over and protect the entire northern kingdom. So, like the Deuteronomic reformers, the Zadokites were committed to the idea that sacrifice should be centralized. It's going to be a monopoly of the Jerusalem temple. We're no longer going to have sacrifices locally at all the high places in the kingdom. Everybody is going to have to bring their animals to Jerusalem, and that will give the king lots more wealth and control, and in alliance with the priesthood there. So the the priestly source, goes so far in the direction of insisting only Aaron and his descendants can do sacrifices, that they actually, in their rewriting of Torah, they actually delete any references to anybody who is not Aaron or his descendants offering a sacrifice. So there is no story of Adam performing a sacrifice, or of Abraham trying to sacrifice his son and getting a substitution, or of Noah making a sacrifice at the time of the rainbow. None of those are in priestly texts, because nobody sacrifices except for Zadokites. So they're very partisan about that. Nevertheless, because Aaron, like I say, is part of that mythic Exodus story. So in other words, Aaron is not just living in Jerusalem in the Jerusalem temple like the people who think they're his descendants. Because of that, they have to figure out, well, how is it, if you're only ever allowed to sacrifice in Jerusalem, how is it that Aaron, who was wandering around the wilderness for 40 years, was able to offer sacrifices there? And so they get around this literarily by having this mobile ark, and indeed a literary precursor of the temple, the tabernacle. So the tabernacle then is described in those stories as a mobile pre-temple, essentially a tent version of what the temple in Jerusalem ends up being. And it's set up in much the same way, and again described extensively in the priestly source in terms of how many cubits to make it. So whereas, like I say, Deuteronomy had made it clear that Levites were given authority over the ark, the priestly source reserves that role for Aaron and his sons, as we read in Numbers 4. So when the camp is set out, Aaron and his sons shall go in, and they'll take down the screening curtain and cover the Ark of the Covenant with it. They shall put it on a covering of fine leather, and they shall spread over that a cloth of all blue, and put its poles in place. So it's only the Aaron and his sons, the Zadokites. These are to be the people that have any kind of access to the Ark. But even Aaron has very special rules, and these are later the rules that apply to the high priest, who claims descent from Aaron, as we read in the book of Leviticus. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron not to come just any time into the sanctuary inside the curtain before the cover that is upon the ark. Don't just come in there any old time, or he will die. For I, the Lord, will appear in the cloud upon the cover." So God is there on that mercy seat, and so you can't just even the high priest can't just come in there anytime. So the priestly source then goes on at length about the rules, so that the Aaronid or Zadokite high priest, who's the only one who's allowed to go in there, must follow that in order to offer sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, when he's allowed into that Holy of Holies. So like I say, because of the literary setting, the tabernacle serves as a stand-in for the later temple, which is what, by the time this was being written about, the priests actually care about, either the temple or their hopes for a restored temple when the temple is built again. And the text describes, like I say, the practice of the high priests at the time of Josiah reforms, or those practices as remembered and idealized by the exiles and those who are returning, depending on when the text is being written. Okay, so that gives us the differing perspectives from the J source, the priestly source, Deuteronomy, our different voices within the Pentateuch, within the Torah, and that kind of rounds out a picture of the Ark once it's edited together to become the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. The rest of these books, the Deuteronomic histories, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st Kings, this is the place where the more dramatic biblical stories about the Ark are found, as we'll see. So the book of Joshua, which is focused on kind of the mythic conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. So after the wandering in Exodus, and actually in the whole Mosaic period, Joshua is Moses' successor, and then he, as a military leader, prophet, leads the people into Canaan. Just as in Deuteronomy, the Levites generally, and not just the Aaronids, not just the Zadokites, The Levites are given charge over the Ark in the Deuteronomic histories. And as with the Yahweh source, as with the J source, the Ark in the book of Joshua especially is carried ahead of the camp during warfare. So for example, when the Israelites at the beginning of the book of Joshua enter the land, they do that by following after the Ark. So we read in chapter 3 of Joshua that early in the morning, Joshua rose up and set out from Shittim, which is the Transjordan, what's now Jordan, with all of the Israelites, and they came to the Jordan River. They camped there before crossing over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, your God, being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place. Follow it so that you may know the way you should go. For you've not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Do not come any nearer to it." So the Ark, you don't even want to get close to this thing. It's dangerous. So as the Levitical priests then carry the Ark and they come to the banks of the Jordan River so that they can begin to walk into it, the water parts, just as had happened with the Red Sea in Exodus with Moses, allowing the Israelites to cross the Jordan River as if on dry land. So it says, while all Israel was crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan River until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. So the Ark is seemingly the center of the thing that is pushing the waters back. In their siege of Jericho, so the first city that they want to take after crossing, Joshua has the Israelites march around the walls of Jericho, carrying the Ark and blowing on the trumpets for 7 days. At the very end, Joshua rose up early in the morning, and the priests took the Ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Ark of the Lord passed on, blowing the trumpets continually. The armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the Ark of the Lord while the trumpets blew continually. So parading around with the Ark here, it's a clearly central part of this formation, and you can see it's like being used here as part of a demonstration of military might as the troops are in before and after it. On the 7th day, when the men blow their horns, the walls of the city miraculously fall down flat, and that allows all of the Israelites to massacre almost everyone inside the city. So in addition to using the Ark as a war standard here, Joshua also uses it, though, for religious purposes. So he calls all Israel together before the Ark in order to renew the covenant with God that they'd made with Moses. So Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, as is written in the book of the law of Moses. He built an altar of unhewn stones on which no iron tool has been used, and they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed offerings of well-being. And there, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses that he'd written. All Israel, alien as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on the opposite sides of the Ark in front of the Levitical priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. So they all have to witness before the Ark here, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded earlier, that they should bless the people of Israel. And afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. So we can already see that just even in this passage, this is different from how the priestly author would have phrased any of this. So the idea that Joshua, who's not an Aaronid, he's building altars that are not in Jerusalem, and he's sacrificing at holy places other than Jerusalem. That's not the way the Zadokite, the priestly authors, would want it. But the Deuteronomists are okay with this because it's something that's happening before the ark finally comes to rest in its final place in Jerusalem. And so that's why we have stories like this in the Deuteronomistic histories. The mention here, though, in this of Mount Gerizim as a holy site for the renewal of the covenant is also then in keeping with the Samaritan tradition. So the Samaritans are another heir of First Temple Israelite religion, separate from Judaism, but with their own tradition and their own version of the Torah. And in their tradition, they hold that the Ark of the Covenant was ultimately housed in their temple on Mount Gerizim and not in the Jerusalem temple. So that's kind of a summary of how we see the Ark used. There's several other places that it's used in the book of Joshua, but that's sort of how we see the two main kinds of ways that the Ark is used. It's only mentioned once in the book of Judges, and the book of Judges records that the Ark was housed for a time at the northern kingdom's holy site of Bethel. So that's that shrine where one of the golden calves was that ultimately Josiah destroys. But in the book of Judges we read, all the Israelites, the whole army, went back to Bethel and wept. Sitting there before the Lord, they fasted that day until evening. Then they offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of the well-being before the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. So he's saying they're saying here this whole time that it's before the Lord, but there's a parenthetical that explains what that means. It says the Ark of the Covenant of God was there in Bethel in those days. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days. So they inquired of the Lord, shall we go out once more into battle against our kinsfolk, the Benjamites, or shall we desist? So they are seeking prophetic answers from the Aaronid high priest who is operating the shrine of the tabernacle and of the Ark of the Covenant, which is, according to Judges here anyway, in Bethel at this time. The Lord answered, go up, for tomorrow I will give them to you into your hands, the Benjamites. So you are supposed to do that. So the exact details of what's going on in that story aren't as important as just the idea that the Ark is this place where these sorts of questions that they bring to God are dealt with when you ask the high priest. So Judges then indicates that the Ark was in the custody of an Aaronid priest, a Zadokite priest, but interestingly, like I say, places it at the northern shrine of Bethel, which is later where one of the northern golden calves is set up that King Josiah destroys after the fall of the northern kingdom. So at the beginning of the book of Samuel, the Ark and the tabernacle are housed at the northern shrine of Shiloh that we already talked about. They're in the custody of Eli the priest and his two sons. So Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are also priests, but they are not good priests. They're the opposite of good priests. In fact, the text in Samuel says, the sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord or for the duties of the priests to serve the people. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan, kettle, cauldron, or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. So all of their attempts to sacrifice to God are being ruined by greedy priests who were taking all of the meat for themselves. The wickedness then of these sons of Eli ends up causing the Ark to be lost for a time. So in those days, we read, the Philistines, the great enemies of the Israelites, mustered for war against Israel. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle was joined, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. When the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord put us to rout today before the Philistines? Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant. Let's see. Oh no, we're missing a slide. So anyway, but I can tell you what they say. Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant, and that'll allow us to win against these Philistines. And so these terrible sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, bring the Ark up with them, and everybody is now rallies around the fact that they have the Ark, and the Israelites are sure they're going to win this battle because they always win with the battle. And so you can see it being again used as this kind of war standard that gets everybody's courage up, and they're ready to charge into battle. And then when the Philistines are seeing, what are these guys over there yelling about? And then they say, oh my goodness, the gods have come into the camp. The Philistines say, woe to us. Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? They're seeing it in their own terms. They're pagans, so they're not seeing it as the God of Israel. They're seeing that the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness are going to come after us now because these Israelites have been rallied and they got their ark back, or got their ark with them. So take courage and be men, O Philistines, they say to each other, in order to not become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines rallied themselves. They fought, and Israel was defeated, even though they had the ark. And the Israelites fled, everyone to his home, and there was a very great slaughter. For there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured by the Philistines, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So it's a terrible rout. So when you have in the hands of bad priests, the ark is not invincible. The army is not invincible the way Marcus Brody, or I think it's Brody said in late Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Israelites actually lost. So even though the ark had failed to bring victory to the Israelites in battle, again due to the wickedness of their priests, the Philistines, though, are not able to benefit from owning it. So they take it to their god Dagon's temple in the Philistine city of Ashdod, and they set it up right next to the big cult statue of Dagon, and they wake up the next morning and the idol has fallen on its face as if it's like worshiping the ark. And so that's no good. You don't ever want your main cult statue to fall down. In addition to that, all the people in Ashdod begin to develop tumors. And so everything is going very bad there. And the Ashdod folks decide to send it to another Philistine city, the city of Gath. The people of Gath likewise start developing tumors, and that causes them to send the ark onto Ekron. Everybody in Ekron panics because everybody's been getting these tumors, and then they all get tumors too. So the Philistines decide that their only recourse is they got to get rid of this thing and give it back to the Israelites. So they put it on a special cart. They put some cows in front of the cart and just let the cows wander away and take it. And they put some other offerings and things to show that they're sorry and they want to make amends with the God of Israel and so forth. So even after the cart kind of wanders back into the Israelite lands and gets back into the hands of some locals, it continues to kill people because only certain people are supposed to be able to touch it. So it's a very dangerous artifact to be running around with. So after the time, of the judges ends, so after Eli, then the next judges is Samuel. And Samuel appoints for Saul and then David to be king. David makes Jerusalem his capital, and he brings the ark there. He sets up the tabernacle on the future Temple Mount. En route, though, the ark continues to be dangerous, so they have it housed in a special cart. And when that cart is unsteady, a man named Uzzah tries to reach out his hand to steady the cart, and he is struck down by God. So again, this is not something you want to be messing around with. In the course of the procession bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David ends up dancing before the Lord with all his might, wearing a linen ephod. His wife, who is King Saul's daughter, who maybe thinks of herself as being very regal and important, thinks David dancing around like this is undignified and unregal and makes her not like him. But David ultimately sets the ark, like I say, up in his capital within the tabernacle. He himself is not permitted by God to build a new temple, but his son and successor Solomon is commanded to do so. And so then we read that the temple is dedicated in 1 Kings. And when that happens, the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. The poles of the ark were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. They are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so the priests could not stand to minister there because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And so after this dedication, after the ark is brought in there, after the priests all leave, and now they can't go back in because God's glory is in there, then Solomon himself concludes, I have provided a place for the ark. He says, I did that, and it's in keeping with that covenant that we made with back in Moses' time. And then once it is in this place, when it's in the sanctuary of Solomon's temple, this is actually the last we explicitly hear of it in the Hebrew Bible, which is interesting. We hear here in the Deuteronomistic history that it's there to this day, and so that might mean up until the time of Josiah, but it's not talked about explicitly. So given all of that, what can we say about the historicity of the Ark? Given that all of our stories about the Ark are really set in the mythic period of the Bible, is the Ark actually, does it have historicity, or is it a kind of MacGuffin that allows these reformers who are so intent on saying you can only sacrifice in Jerusalem, they needing to fit an Exodus story where the Israelites are moving all around, they must be able to, they have to be able to have for sacrifices before the foundation of the temple. So is it a thing that is created literarily to describe that? I'll just say there isn't anything unusual about a more mobile shrine, or even a mobile shrine sort of acting as a war chariot or as a military standard. One of the very famous examples of this is the medieval Lombard League. So the various rich Italian city-states that were trying to band together to prevent the German Holy Roman Emperors from taking away, from taxing them and that kind of a thing, from imposing imperial officials and customs and other duties on them. They rebelled and asserted their own rights, and when they would get their armies together, they had this four-wheeled war chariot. There's a kind of a modern reproduction of what it might have looked like, called the carroccio, and they would bring this into battle against the Holy Roman Emperors. It would rally, it would have symbols of all of the different leagues and guilds and cities, so that everybody would feel committed to being a part of it. It also included like a mobile altar, so that the Lombard priests are able to, again, have God's favor be part of it. You can see it had big crosses on it and that kind of a thing. And it's the kind of thing that sometimes when they lost the battle, the emperors would steal the carroccio, and they got it now. So that would make everybody really upset. The same way the Israelites are upset when the Philistines get a hold of their ark, obviously. So this is not an unheard of thing in antiquity or even the Middle Ages to have one of these things. However, if the ark had been used in that kind of a way, like the carroccio, the way it's used, inside Judges or Samuel or Joshua's time in the Exodus stories, it hadn't been done that. It doesn't seem to have been used that way at the time the biblical narratives are written down. So if it was used like that originally, if there's a historical ark that was being used that way, they'd long since, by the time they were writing biblical text down, it was not moving out of the temple anymore. In other words, now it's in the Solomon's temple and it's staying there. So, for example, we don't hear in the reign of Hezekiah, when the Assyrians are laying siege for years and years to Jerusalem, and you need to rally the defenders, you don't hear them like taking the ark around out of the temple and making everybody, all excited to we're gonna survive here and kick these Assyrians out or something like that. Same thing when this later King Josiah, when he goes to Megiddo, he goes to Armageddon and gets killed by Pharaoh Necho. We don't hear, like, for example, that Josiah had brought the ark there or something in order to say, hey, we're tough, you can't hurt us, that kind of thing. That's not the way it's being used. It happens like that in the more legendary period, not in the more historical period. What I would also suggest is just the form of the ark itself, the fact that this is not an idol, but in fact is instead like those golden calves of Israel that are forming a footstool or a resting place for God's invisible glory. This is dating to the development of this more sophisticated iconoclastic idea of God, and so as Yahwehism is developing out of standard paganism into henotheism and monolatry, that's when this kind of thing would be dating to, because otherwise you would just have a regular cult statue. So it can't go back to that the time period when Moses would have supposedly been alive if Moses was a historical figure, because we wouldn't have this kind of an understanding of God back then. So, like I say, then the ark probably, it could date back to before the fall of Israel, but probably not, if there was a historic ark, not all the way back to the legendary periods, the Exodus or anything like that. I pointed out in Samuel, in the Psalms, and in Jeremiah, this association with Shiloh, one of the northern shrines, and maybe one of the places where lines of priests, maybe priests associated with Jeremiah. That could suggest that maybe, and this is just a hypothesis, maybe there was a historical ark that was at Shiloh, like the book of Samuel says, where there was an early national shrine to Yahweh under the Israelite kings, which then, when the northern kingdom is destroyed, the priests there and other exiles, they fled from the Assyrians and made their way to Jerusalem, and they took this very special Yahweh artifact, the Ark of the Lord, and it got put into the Jerusalem temple, and then over a couple generations, it may have already, back up at Shiloh, had Mosaic associations. The Shiloh priests might have considered themselves to be descendants of Moses and so on, in the same way that the Jerusalem priests considered themselves descendants of Aaron. But again, this is speculation, so we don't know. But it does, like I say, I'm not trying to argue against the historicity of the ark. There's nothing saying that they couldn't have had a shrine like this, but it's the question then is, where did it come from before it was in the Jerusalem temple? And it probably doesn't go, and it certainly doesn't go all the way back to the mythic period like Moses or Solomon even. So what happened to the ark? Well, Raiders of the Lost Ark, I think, has the most popular proposal of what happened to the ark, that it's safely hidden in a warehouse in Arlington, Virginia. It's a very fun ending to the movie. The other part of the Raiders theory is based on a part of another mention of, not explicitly the ark, but of an incident that is recorded in the book of Chronicles. So in Chronicles 12:9, Pharaoh Shishak, it says, of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem during the reign of Rehoboam, and it says he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord. He took everything, it says. So in theory then, if the ark was in the temple, as early as right after Solomon, the ark is taken by the Egyptians. It doesn't say it explicitly though, but we also, I mentioned, don't really hear about the ark afterwards. So according to Raiders of the Lost Ark, Shishak is Pharaoh Shoshenq I, and according to them, he then took the ark back to a new treasure city called Tanis, where he buried it in the Well of Souls. And of course, you can identify where the Well of Souls is when you go to the map room. If you have a staff of Ra, and at a certain time of day, the sunlight will beam through the crystal in the staff of Ra. As long as you remember to make it the right height, you have to take back one chadim to honor the Hebrew god whose ark this is. So normally, if anything is going to survive from antiquity to the present, and this is true especially for manuscripts like the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, going out and burying it in the Egyptian desert is a really good way to accomplish it. Unfortunately, this is less true for gold objects in pharaonic treasure cities. I mean, certainly there have been a bunch of gold artifacts that did make us down to us, not the important ones. So King Tutankhamun was a less important king, and grave robbers got most everybody else's stuff, but this one they didn't find, and so we found it in the 20th century. So, like I say, these kind of objects tend to get looted, and so not likely to be lying around, frankly, buried in Egypt anywhere, I would suggest. The other problem, of course, is Shoshenq I is a historical figure. We have great records for Egypt. But, when he's talking about, when he's attacking right after the time of Solomon. Solomon is legendary time. So, like I say, a shrine like the Ark that's made with the idea of avoiding depiction of Yahweh, that would date to a later period. So this time period, if Shoshenq, the actual historical king, attacked Jerusalem, this is really before Jerusalem was really the way it would have been. So there probably wouldn't have been an Ark there. So then for the Ark to actually be in Egypt, we'd have to have had it snatched by a later pharaoh, like Necho II, that guy who killed King Josiah at Megiddo. But again, we don't have any mention that Josiah had brought it or anything like that. Or to get it to Egypt, it's possible that, again, if it was still present in the Jerusalem temple right before its destruction by the Babylonians, maybe an important figure like Jeremiah and the chiefs of the army who fled with him to Egypt, they might have brought it with them. And that could be a way it could get to Egypt. We don't have any ancient sources, though, that indicated Jeremiah took the Ark to Egypt, or, like I say, that the Ark was running around with Josiah, and that kind of thing. There is, in the second book of Maccabees, a claim that Jeremiah saved the Ark by burying it at a cave around Mount Nebo. So, which is to say, in the kind of Jordan area. So one finds in the records that the prophet Jeremiah, this is what the book of 2nd Maccabees says, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent, the tabernacle, and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God, that is, Mount Nebo. Jeremiah came there and found a cave dwelling, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense, and then he sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed him came intending to mark the way, but they could not find it. When Jeremiah learned that people were trying to find it, he rebuked them, and he declared, "This place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear, as we were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked the place should be specially consecrated." So, anyway, this is a late source. 2nd Maccabees, it's an ancient source, but it's still, hundreds of years late. It doesn't, even though they're claiming that the records show this, but there's not necessarily, I think, any particular basis to buy it from the source, and it more likely seems to be messianic wishful thinking, where people are hoping, that it's gone into this kind of magic place, like King Arthur is going to come back in case, if when Britain needs him, the Excalibur will come back from the lake or wherever it is. The Holy Grail will come back, the Ark of the Covenant will come back. That's, I think, what this story is telling us. There are claimants who have the Ark to this day. One of the best ones is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So they claim that they have the custody of the true Ark, which is housed in Aksum, ancient city that had been the center of a medieval Christian kingdom. They claim that a legendary king, Menelik, from the Solomonic dynasty of Aksum, brought the true ark home with him, and that, in fact, that he had substituted a forgery which was left in Jerusalem to get destroyed and all those things. The tradition that they have the ark in Ethiopia does date all the way back to the Middle Ages, so they have an artifact that, according to the few Western scholars, or one Western scholar to actually examine it in the middle of the 20th century, believes that it's a medieval artifact. But it's one, so in other words, it's something that is a tradition that's maybe as much as 1,000 years old, that they've maintained this tradition. The Lemba people, who are in South Africa and Zimbabwe, also have a tradition that they have what is the true ark, and they also have a story of how it got taken maybe via Yemen and eventually farther south until it all the way got to them. There's a bunch of more modern ideas. British Israelitism, they've claimed that the Egyptian princess Tea Tefi brought the ark to Ireland when she married King Araman of Ireland, and it's now buried in the hill of Tara. There's all kinds of places, a lot of people, I'm sure, wonder, the secret order of the Templars, who in the other Indiana Jones movie have the Holy Grail, maybe they got the ark, so there'd be other kinds of possibilities that anybody might want to have. The most likely scenario, if it had survived to the time when Jerusalem was destroyed and was in the temple there, it was then taken by the Babylonians, who sacked the city, back to Babylon. Gold artifacts like this don't last as gold artifacts. The gold gets melted down and becomes other things. And so, like I said, if it had continued to exist until Jerusalem's destruction, unfortunately, the most likely scenario is that it was taken to Babylon as plunder and broken apart, and has no further story after that. But that's nowhere near as fun as the ending in Raiders, and so not discouraging you from thinking that it's in that warehouse. And that's my take on what is the Ark of the Covenant. And so while Leandro is getting your questions assembled, I'm going to drink water. All right. Oops.
I don't know where you're at.
You've got to go. I can't see I'm seeing Winston Barquez's question.
Oh, okay.
You have to roll. I mean, you need to scroll it up for me so that I can see maybe who gave things, or I don't know.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know what happened. Okay, getting our. There it is. All right, I want to thank people for all of your support. Thanks to Ron Wagner, to JM, to Dartharama, to Michael Mervine, to Dave Anderson, to Fire Ever Living, to Max Zielinski. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate any donations you're able to give. That, like I say, I like having the capacity to do these every week if possible, because they're a lot of fun to be able to research and share. Ron Wagner says, could the Ark be mentioned in other Jewish literature? So yeah, there are traditions in rabbinic literature of what happened to it, and then there's also medieval Jewish understandings of it. I think that there was a medieval Jewish rabbi who thought that they saw it in Rome or something like that. So in other words, I think there's a bunch of different traditions. I didn't go through, there's a mention of the Ark in the Quran. I didn't go through exhaustively what all of the other options are, but yes, certainly there are traditions in rabbinic and post-rabbinic literature. Videos for Stuff said, I have heard seraphim translated more closely like flying snakes. If there was an ark, do you think seraph would look more like angels or weird dragons? So I think that as I was reading it, it's we just barely read the priestly source's description of it, and it's cherubim, not the seraphim. And so, and I think that those are generally understood to be more like the angels. The only other way I've seen them depicted as opposed to angels is more like the, between the seraphim and cherubim is more like the, like what we might think of as Babylonian, like winged lion sphinxes kind of thing, or so like in other words, you have a bull that has wings that has a head of a human being. So I've seen depictions like that, and then I've just seen depictions that are more like angels, and sometimes angels with more than just two wings. Winston Barquez asks, how is the Blessed Virgin Mary a type of ark? So I also didn't go through. I only went through the references to the ark in the Hebrew Bible, not in. So I didn't do like later rabbinic tradition, Talmud, and that kind of thing. But I also didn't do the New Testament. And so in the Gospel of Luke, that's an analogy that's made. So Christians see Old Testament stories as symbolic. They see them as typological. And so one of the things that the author of Luke has is an idea, we're talking about the Virgin Mary as a type of ark. So in the same way that the ark has a seat that is able to contain or be a expression of the presence of the Lord, and the presence of the Lord is seen to be there, on the seat of the ark. So too, God's presence is housed in the Blessed Virgin Mary when she is with child before the birth of Christ, right? So I think that's the analogy that Luke is making. Bo the Wolf, what precisely does the church in Aksum, Ethiopia claim to have? The Ark? Yes, the Ark. They claim to have the Ark of the Covenant. So the idea of it is, like I say, that the Ethiopian Solomonic prince and king was able to swap out the real one for the fake one, which they kept the fake one in Jerusalem. They took the real one for safekeeping into Aksum. And so that's what they claim to have. K. Tempest Bradford. Are the broken tablets in the ark, or is it the second set? We were just reading that in Deuteronomy, and to me it sounds like the second set's in there. so they said they went and got a second set of tablets. God wrote on them again. He comes back down. He puts them in the ark. So in Deuteronomy anyway, it does seem like it's the second set of them. Hislang says, what is the origin of the ark if the Exodus narrative is non-historical? So when we're ever looking at those kinds of things, it depends on where it is in actual history. And the problem that I was having with the ark is, is it actually in the Jerusalem temple right up until the end of it, or is it already been lost before then? So what I think it's understood to be, and let's say it was there up until the destruction of the temple. It's what is the origin of the ark if the Exodus narrative is not historical? It is a shrine item within the Jerusalem temple, and then it is given this mythic backstory that puts it wandering around in the Exodus. And so I've suggested that that one thing it could have been before it got brought to the Jerusalem temple is that maybe it was the major shrine throne seat for God that came from the Shiloh temple, a Shiloh shrine before the kingdom of Israel was destroyed. And maybe the priests of Shiloh had that same tradition, that it had actually been from Moses, their ancestor, and that it contained the actual tablets of the law. So again, even so, that would be a traditional claim, the same way that the folks in Ethiopia have a traditional claim. It's a claim that they could have had for a long standing, but it wouldn't be historical. And so that's where it could have come from. Chris McCarthy, thank you for your support. Chris asks, is it just a coincidence that both culture heroes, Noah and Moses, have an ark? And I guess I'd have to see. So I have to say I've read this whole thing in translation, so I would have to look and see, is that the exact same word that is being used in, I mean, it's the same word in English, or is that translated from the same word in Hebrew? And I didn't go back and look at the Noah story to make a comparison. So it might be a coincidence, but it might not. Part of the issue, if it is using the same word, part of the issue is the Israelites were not a seafaring people. and so Noah's story, even though it's a story about a flood and a boat and things like that. Okay, so we looked it up. It's not the same word, so it's a coincidence in English. Is the answer to that. Okay, so thank you. So Harvey Esquire says, so the golden calf is demonized because the Northern Kingdom used a calf statue in its temple. Yes. Yeah, so that seems very clear because there's a very strange, it has a very strange presence that's weaved through the Deuteronomistic histories. So there is this story in the Exodus of Aaron actually making this golden calf. And when he comes down, he says, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who led you out of Egypt," even though there's only one calf. And this is the same thing that is then said when the king of Israel makes a golden calf at these two shrines. And so it seems to be a like a Judahite, later demonizing of the Israelite kingdom, but actually because the kings of Israel actually often had Yahwist theophoric names, they seem to have been centralizing, or the earliest place where Yahwism is being centralized, and under this understanding of Yahweh as a God of Israel. But because the later reformers in Jerusalem are trying to delegitimize Bethel, and as soon as they get a chance, they go up and actually attack it and destroy the shrine up there, this seems to be being demonized as opposed to being the actual history. So I think the actual history, I think the Northern Kingdom is probably trying to do the same thing that these cherubim are doing with the Ark of the Covenant. You could look at those and say that looks like an idol to me because it's a statue, it's got wings and stuff like that. In the same way, the golden calves, those are things like God is standing on. If you ever go to Hindu temples, there's these almost all the gods have their own little kind of chariot guy that they can run around on top of. And so this would be the same kind of way. Yahweh is standing on top of these bulls. That's what Baal does too. So, where are we? Harvey Esquire. No, I just read that. Sorry, Harvey. So G.J. Lionheart. Didn't they need the ark to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land? They used the ark to cross the Jordan to the Promised Land. We read that in Joshua, that passage of Joshua that we read. I don't know that they needed it. They could have, if they didn't have the ark, they could have presumably forded the river. It's not a hugely big river, but also they could have also gotten a ferry to get across it. But they used the ark to cross over on dry land. Is Bethel related to Bethlehem? No, the Bethlehem is a town that is immediately south of Jerusalem. Bethel is a town that's north of Jerusalem. The word Beth is the same in Hebrew. It means house, and so El means house of God. And then, and again, I don't know Hebrew, so Bethlehem means house of something else. So, K. Tempest Bradford, Dan McClellan has made the argument that the ark actually functions as an idol the way it's talked about in the Bible. Have you seen or read that? What do you think of that, his thesis? So, I've kind of made this point before too, which is I understand the impetus about iconoclasm, but we've had a whole lecture on iconoclasm. I'm dubious of iconoclasm and also dubious about religious prohibitions against making paintings or statues and things like that. The way that idols are talked about in the Bible, the way that religious statues are talked about in the Bible, is a partisan way. In other words, and this is also definitely true in the Quran, where it's imagined that pagans, that Hindus or somebody, that they think that the actual statue is God, which they don't. They think that this is a sacred item that connects them to God. So this is not God. In the same way, here we have an artifact, a holy relic, and God is sitting on the seat. So it functions the same way. It's not God. It's connecting you to the unseen God. And so in that sense, I do think it functions the same way. In the same way that even if you're a full iconoclast and you don't believe in any imagery, you don't say God's name or anything like that, then the religious text maybe becomes your idol. So you have the Quran, you have the Bible, and in your Bible-based worship, and so then suddenly that's your connection, and you impute authority to it that makes it function that same way. So that's, I think, what I think of the thesis, which is that we make these distinctions, especially between polytheism and monotheism, that maybe don't make a lot of sense. It depends on how there's an underlying theology that is a more important question, or really the more important question is what you think God is actually doing or not. There are other theological questions, I think, that are more important. Connie Jo Humphrey says, somewhere in the Bible it says manna and Aaron's rod were also placed in the ark. Yes, so I was just reading that too. It's like we said, the Bible contradicts itself. The passage that we read, it says, I think it was probably when we were reading it in Kings, it said the only thing that's in the ark is the tablets. But in other places, it says that there's also manna in there, and it also that Aaron's rod is in there. So yes. So we can also just say, Leandra looked it up for us. So it says that that's included in Hebrews and so on. So there's in Hebrews 9. So like I said, I didn't include the New Testament versions or New Testament references because they're late. Fire Ever Living says, are there any groups within Judaism who want to create a new ark? You have the prophecy against that in Jeremiah, so they would have to decide that Jeremiah was wrong there, or not want to, or just ignore that verse, I guess. I haven't heard I know that there are groups that want to do all sorts of things, but I don't know. I haven't heard of anybody making another ark. Like I say, Jeremiah says there's going to be a time when there won't be one, but who knows? Maybe somebody does want to. Can we scroll down? I'm at Josh Bedford. Oh, I guess I have the control. Okay. Ever heard of the idea from Ron Wyatt that he found the ark under the Protestant Golgotha? Jesus' blood dripped on it, but he couldn't take it out because it was slippery or something. I haven't heard that. I don't know. I mean, I've been to the Protestant Golgotha. I was very pleased that the space is not promoted in a partisan way. They're not saying we're not making any special claims about this. There's reasons why why the identification was made, and it's become a sacred place for people in modern times, and it isn't important whether or not it was the actual Golgotha. There's reasons why some people believe it is, but there's reasons why others don't, and that they're not in any way attempting to compete with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or that kind of thing. So I really appreciate that. In terms of anybody having seen it there, that's a pretty dubious claim, probably. I appreciate the idea that treasures become slippery and get pulled under the ground and things like that is something that people believed in the 19th century. UR and ARG says, do you know enough about Freemasonry to discuss how the Ark relates to how Masonry reenacts Old Testament myths about Solomon's temple? I often use their symbolism for meditations. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Freemasonry, so I have never spent a lot of time studying it. And so I know that, like you say, the Masonry involves like a retelling of Solomon's temple ideas, and the idea that the Masons who there was a connection or a spiritual connection with the Masons who built that temple. But I don't know the details between the Masonic rituals and myths enough to talk about it, I'm sorry to say. Patricia Anderson says, as I understand, you could not touch the Ark or you would die from something like an electrical shock. So how could they take it apart? So it's not entirely consistent. And so I read that passage where Uzzah, was stuck out his hand to steady the cart and he got struck dead. So that happened for him, but somehow it's not going to be totally consistent because the Philistines captured it and they were running around with it, right? So somebody was touching it, in order to bring it to all of those different Philistine cities, even though the Bible doesn't explicitly say how they got it there. It's just once they got it there, everybody started getting tumors, So you must have been able to touch it without dying. And in terms of, if you're talking about how they get it apart, well, the people in Raiders of the Lost Ark were able to touch it without dying because Indiana Jones and his friend Sulla touched it, and also the Nazis that were carrying it around and took the top off of it were able to touch it, and then they ended up dying once it was open. So it's an inconsistent death machine, both as it's described in the Bible and in the movie. It doesn't just shock you to death every single time, but it did get Uzzah, as you point out. So a lot of people are protected from that. So, if you are, there are rules about how Aaron and his sons, the chief priest, the high priest of the Zadokite line, how they're able to be in the presence of it. And I think that's it, right? Okay, folks. Well, we're going to talk about the Gospel of John, and we're going to talk about the less fun topic of anti-Semitism, but hopefully also giving it some context. So, see you next week.